record is now going on, and this will be captured. Most of the time I use Adobe Connect to record things and provide the link, but if I want to embed the video somewhere, rather than just provide a link, I'll use CSU Replay. So a bit of housekeeping. The pods that we have at the top, the polls, etc., I'll be moving those out of the way in just a moment so that we can have the share pod for everyone to look at. You're more than welcome to use the communal chat pod in the corner here, as everyone's been doing, but keep in mind that if you've got specific questions that you'd like me to address when we have question time, can you please pop them into the Q&A pod here? That way I can get to them specifically, and even if we don't hit it in time, I can respond to all of those as a collection and send out replies. What else can I tell you? There are 2 share pods in this room for your benefit. The first one is a link share here that's got a collection of sites that you might like to have a look at whilst we're talking, but we'll certainly provide a cheat sheet after the workshop that will have the resources that are used and also the main points covered. I think that's about it before we get into things. Does anyone have any specific questions for me to think about before I kick off? Alright then, I'll take that as a no, and I'll just start rearranging the furniture. Let's move this out of the way. If this looks messy to you, you should see my living room. Let's just get this out of the way. Okay. So I'm going to share my screen in a moment and we'll start having a look at exactly what H5P is. With the share pod, you're more than welcome to maximize that so that you can see it for full screen. And I can still see your comments, etc. in the chat pod. So H5P that we're looking at today is a platform. It's an open source tool. It's got a collection of people that feed into it and build tools for the sake of contributing to that, the wider exploration of how that software can be used. So it's not for profit essentially. The website itself that we're looking at to begin with is h5p.org. You're more than welcome to go and have a look at that whilst we're talking or after the fact. So this is a public website, and there are some videos on the front page that give a brief introduction to what the tool is for, but basically it's about creating content. Most useful in the site for me is to go straight to the examples and downloads page to give us a bit of an idea about exactly what this thing is. And as we scroll down, we'll see that there are a number of content types or activity types, if you like, that you can scroll through, and there really is a huge collection in here that's being added to all the time. Some of them you might think are a gimmick, some of them you might think are useful, but basically you're able to create these objects online and then drop them into your content. So your learning modules, for example, in I2 or subject sites, landing pages, org sites, whatever you like. Some of them have other features, like an audio recorder would allow students, for example, to record audio and drop it in and use that for something. Most of them, actually all of them, are about interaction, engagement and interaction. So I'm not going to actually open up these examples and go through them specifically, but I will show you a few examples shortly of how they've been used at CSU. But you'll find that some of them are activity types that maybe you haven't been able to do yourself to date with the tools available in I2, and they give you some options. You can see that some of them are image based, some of them are sound based, some of them are quite tactile. They involve moving objects around. And basically all of these require that you go in and have a play and have a think about how you might like to use that idea or not within one of your subjects. So that's the first piece of advice today, really, is to go in and have an explore and a play inside the h5p.org website, just clicking on examples and downloads. You don't even have to create an account in here really. You can just go into the examples, click on one of them, and have a look at the example that they provide about how it might be used. So this one's a chart. Okay, it makes colorful charts. They can display like X, Y, and Z. All right, I could use that, and then think about we'll talk about accessing that and how we build that into CSU websites a little later in the session. So that's the first tip. Go to the public website and have a look around and play at the example activity types that are in there, and it might give you some ideas and some inspiration, or at least you'll be a bit more familiar with the scope of the activity types in H5P. If we have a look at some CSU specific examples, this is in a science site, for example, dealing with horticulture, agriculture, and the academic has made a collection of flashcards, for example, that students can interact with. And there's a question here about cows, what type, and analytics. Cows and analytics, there we go. They get a question, they get an answer. So the old flashcard concept, okay, and there's a series of those that are built into the site. It's not connected to anything, it certainly doesn't feed into the grade center, etc. But it does give the students a different way of engaging with their content, and that can be reused and dropped into session after session, stay as part of learning module content, maybe be used somewhere else in the site. That's just one activity type. Flashcards, what else have we got? This activity, again, science, is they've made a drag and drop activity where the students can start dragging the responses to things into the statements there, and then they'll get a response at the end once they've done that. How does that work? Check. Not so good. Only 3 out of 10. I can have another crack, or I can see what the solution is. What are the correct answers? Okay. So that's drag and drop. Here we've got a law subject, the Faculty of Business, for example, and they've used a hotspot image that they've provided to inform the tort of negligence. And the students are able to click on different areas of the hotspot, and they're prompted with focus questions, for example, that connect up to the subject in some way. This one's talking about liability and where they might find more information, for example. And then they break out into the text and other areas of the module. So that's an idea of how to use one of the activity types. That was the hotspot activity type. And then this one, a few of you might be more familiar with, where they've used the timeline tool, which is in H5P, to make a subject timeline, which sits on the landing page. And that's been configured to talk about topics, readings, and important tasks. And the students have control over that continuum. They can go to any week of the program that they like. So they might be wanting to see what they need to do in week 6. Okay, right, there's the topic. There are the readings. No assessment tasks. Sweet. Okay, can move on to the next week, the next week, the next week, etc., etc. And I've seen these populated with larger amounts of data about the week in question, and others use quite generic kind of content about what to do each week. That's really at the academic's discretion. This particular activity type takes video, hyperlinks. You can attach documents to it if you need to, but it's quite popular with landing pages at the moment, used in this fashion. So that's taking one particular tool from the H5P suite, which right down the bottom is the timeline tool, and the education support coordinators at CSU are able to take data from subject outline, put it into that timeline, and then come up with something like that to sit on the students' home pages each time they come in, and they can check things like that. So that's a few examples of how the tools in the H5P suite can be used. But there are, as I said, many other ways that you could use those tools. It's really just limited by how you might apply it to your particular area of expertise. So we've looked at some examples. I'll stop sharing for a second there, and take some questions for a moment if you've got any, and then we shall continue on. If it's all good and everyone's okay with where the speed that I'm going at, etc., by all means indicate that in the chat pod or give me a thumbs up, whatever you like. Brilliant. Thank you, William. All right. So we've looked at what the resource is and how it's being used at CSU. Kelly Smith has raised her hand. Kelly, I can give you mic rights if you've got something you'd like to ask at this point. Do you want to raise your hand again? I can do that. Oh, all good. Thumbs up. Never mind. Okay, nothing to see here. We'll keep going. So I'll share my screen again and we'll start looking at how H5P is being used at CSU and how you get access to it. Before I do that, I will clarify that we've looked at the public site, but there is a reason that we don't create content in that public site anymore for our subjects, and that's because it's basically searchable at that point and not secure. So we've also got intellectual property issues. If we've got content that's being made at CSU, we'd like it to stay on our servers so it's protected and not being misused in some way. So people in DLT have come up with a secure platform that you can access the full H5P suite, use whatever tools you like, create your content, and then get it added into your subject sites without worrying about security issues out on the public web space. So I'll keep sharing my screen and we'll have a look at how that's done. Okay, so let me close a few of those example sites, clean things up a little here. This website that I'm looking at the moment is h5p.csu.edu.au. And this website is basically where you start if you'd like to request for your subject to have access to the H5P tools and for you to be able to access that building tool. So those two things happen together. Your subject is added to the back end of this system so that you can access those tools, so that ESCs can access those tools, and you also are given access to that. So it all starts with a form that basically you fill out, putting in your details, and then you submit that after you put in the subject code, and you will get a confirmation message. Could happen within an hour, could happen within 24 hours. It basically depends on how busy people are at the time, but there's a little bit of turnaround time, but not too much. You put in the request and you will get an email confirmation in your mailbox that basically says it's been set up for you, and that will provide you with a link to be able to go into the back end of your subject in this H5P CSU platform. Once you log into that platform, it will look like this. So I'm looking at one for law 114 at the moment, but things are fairly slow internet wise this morning, so bear with me. TextPod, I can see a few things. Ryan's provided the link, thank you very much. Brilliant, thanks Ryan, he's looking after me. When you first come into your subject, you may not see this H5P content tab on the left here. If it's not there, then you're going to need to add that item in here. So it's a plugin basically that you might want to get added to your site. Now there's a video on how to do that inside our training room in the collection of links that I've provided. There's 2 videos there in fact, and I do advise you to watch both of those because it will take you through those steps specifically. It only takes a moment, but in case I get caught up here clicking on the wrong thing, it's either a plugin or a widget. I'll just try and remember which, but feel free to prompt me, other experts in the room. Or maybe it's even been recalled something else. We might go straight into H5P content and have a look. Sam says it's a plugin. Brilliant. Thank you, Sam. When you do click on that H5P content item, assuming it's there, Is there a way to increase the size of the screen? Good question. I'll do that. How's that? So I've gone into this H5P content item. We'll just wait for this to load. As I said, things are very, very slow this morning, so I do apologize for that. Oof. We need some elevator music for this, I think. A little bit more. Okay. Don't forget with your share pod, if you're looking at it just in the share pod, you can full screen that share pod using the 4 arrows in the top right hand corner of the pod. Okay, so I've gone into that item and I can see they've already got a number of H5P content types. However, let's assume that you are starting from scratch and you wanted to make a new one. You can click on Add New. We'll just wait for the little hamster to turn the computer wheel around a few times. I can say that on any other day except for today, this has always been a very quick process for me and it populates very quickly. So I apologize again. So I've got the option here. I just need to make this a bit smaller. It's loading all of the activity types that you can choose from, is what we're waiting for. And while you're waiting, you might want to have a look at that public h5p.org website and the example tool types in there. By all means play around, but this is pretty crazy. It's just not loading for me. Here we go. Content type, thank you. Right, I can hit this drop down button and at that point I've got that full list that we were looking at beforehand. Hotspots, true false questions, timelines, quizzes, images, summaries, etc. That list goes on and on and on, so I'm not going to get too far into that at the moment. But once you've had a play around on that public website and had an idea of the type of tool you'd like to add to your subject, then you can come in here and type in the name that you might like to give it. That's not going to appear anywhere. You're then able to choose the type of question or activity type that you want to use. So in this case, let's say I want to use true false. Again, I'll just wait for it to populate. Maybe it's affected by the cold weather. And Kelly, I definitely agree, the hamster does need a holiday. Alright, in this case it's a true-false question. So I can put in my question, put in the answer, talk about how I want this activity type to behave, do I want them to be able to retry, etc. These options are going to be different depending on which activity type you've chosen. Do you want any feedback if they get the correct answer in this case? Nice one. Poor response, etc. And then I can publish my activity, or in this case, because it's my first time, I can create. And we'll just wait for the internet yet again. Wow, that's killing me. Certainly use this time, people, to put things into the chat pod. I'm reading it. That's a very good question, Girish. I'll show you once this finishes publishing. Usually it's instantaneous. What it's going to give us at the end is a preview, if you will, of what the activity is going to look like in the subject site. So we'll just have a look now as it finally loads. And I'm able to write. So on my subject site, it's going to look like this, and the students will be able to choose an answer, check the answer, etc., and they get a response. Great. At that point, what I'm interested in is this embed code that's underneath. When you click that, it's highlighted the code that we need, which you can then copy, Control C, go back into a subject site that you want to play around with. So I might just use my sandbox to do this, and I will turn my edit mode on. I'm going to put this into a new content item. Give that a name. And then in here, I want it to go into this blank area. I can just turn on the HTML code and paste, Control V, hit update. That doesn't tell me much except that there's something that's been dropped in there, and I can now submit that. I'll just move my chat thing out of the way. Now that I've submitted it, let's turn off my edit mode and we'll have a look at what that looks like. Right to the bottom, activity, here we go. We'll just wait for it to load. Again, this has got to be my internet this morning rather than, or Bathurst CSU's internet I should say, rather than any of yours, I hope. Here it is, line by line. Thank you, Ian. Okay, so we can finally see, here's the activity that's sitting inside my content, ready for people to play around with. So basically, create the activity, get the embed code, come back into your I2 site, edit a content item, and turn on your HTML code and drop in that embed code and publish. And there it is, ready to use. I'm going to stop sharing at that moment so we can talk a little bit about that and I can stop being frustrated by the internet. But basically, if any of that embedding side of things is a little bit beyond you, you're not happy with that, you've definitely got the option to submit an SRS request to have an ESC help you with that, for example. The process gets very, very easy the more you practice with it, and you'll find yourself just experimenting with all the different question types, activity types, and how they might make your content look a bit more interesting. Let's have a look at some of the questions that we've got in the Q&A. So you're talking about repeating a URL. I'm going to assume that's the CSU H5P URL, or is it the public one? Both of them are up here in the link share pod that we've got up here, but the public site is at h5p.org and the CSU site is csu.h5p. Never mind, h5p.csu.edu.au. Okay, brilliant. Next question. Miranda says, with the video links that you've shared, it looks like the links are to the same video. You know what, I may very well have done that. I'll have to check, but I will send out a cheat sheet that does contain all the correct detail for you. So we're at 10:30 or close to. Can I increase the screen myself by clicking on the arrow at the top of the pod? Good point, Rhonda. Yep. This is probably a good time for specific questions if you've got them. Otherwise, I'll go back into the back end of the platform, but I will point out that the speed of the internet this morning is making things very difficult for me. What haven't we covered yet? We talked about publishing content and embedding it into I2 sites. Girish says, how easy is it to export all the activities? So moving activities across from one session to another, that's a good question. Because they're sitting within your learning modules, the embed code is not specific to your subject site. It's sitting separately on that H5P server. So that means that as long as you've copied the learning modules over from one session to the other, those activities will still be there. Is that fairly straightforward? Brilliant. Difference between CSU or the H5P site. One of them's public, which means that what you create in there is accessible by everyone. Once you publish it on there, it can be found by anyone else on the internet. They can go looking for it. The content's not private. Um, and yes, a lot of people have been using the timelines directly from H5P public site. That's where I started building them as well. And I think my public H5P login has about 200 timelines in it at the moment. We're slowly moving those across into the CSU secure platform for building. Um, yeah, so I mean, when we talk about a strategy for how to play around with this, I generally recommend that you do create a login on the public site and have a play around with different tool types to give you some ideas. But when you've figured out which subject and what activity type you actually want to publish and create, um, go through that process of requesting your subject be added to the H5P CSU platform. It's a good question, Sue. It basically you do need to request it to be set up for each subject. What you do find though is when you log in, after that, you're able to actually get a collection of all of your sites in a list, so you can jump between them yourself once they've been added. Leanne, it can absolutely be used for anywhere that you can drop in that HTML code, the iframe code. As long as they've got the ability to turn the code on, you can drop those objects in. Sam's put in a great response in the chat pod there. The other reason that we have it in this CSU backend at the subject level is that an ESC might be working on it with you to help you with your item that you're creating. You might have other staff that come in to teach the subject later on that also have other types of tools and activities that they can add to. What happens if it needs to be updated the following session and you're on leave or not around? Basically, create it at the subject level and we can add whoever needs access to it without having to worry about who originally owned it, so to speak. Okay, Sarah, I think probably what you would find, Sam might put in a response there. Yep, if you just put in the name of the project, they'll create the actual location on that spine, that H5P spine for CSU for you to use. So we can certainly work around that. Thank you for the people that have got to go. I'm certainly happy to hang around and answer questions and things, but this really was a brief introduction to the public and the CSU site and how to use them, and where to get more information and start building yourself. And as I mentioned, I'm going to put together a cheat sheet to go along with the video recording. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Christopher. And thank you, everyone, for turning up. Yes, it's a long-term resource, Sue. I'm not quite sure that's true about Padlet. You just need to be fairly selective about how you use it. Every user can use 3 of them, can create 3 Padlets, which just means that you might need several people with accounts to keep using Padlet. Rhonda, good question. I'm going to probably update everyone individually on that, but we have a central PD hub that I'm going to place the embedded video recording on. Pleasure. And yes, Deborah, I will provide a recording to everyone for this.